I said turn around, put your hands behind your back.
On what charges, officer?
You're being detained for obstruction.
I want it on your body cam that I am Magistrate Judge Robert Franklin. You are violating my Fourth Amendment rights.
The Saturday afternoon of March 15, 2024, at the Central Public Library, should have been just another quiet moment between father and daughter, a silent pause from the outside world where children's books and imagination created their own safe universe. But at 2:20 p.m., a police officer would enter the children's section and commit a mistake so grotesque, so steeped in racial prejudice, that it would cost the city $500,000 in legal settlements. The man sitting in that small yellow chair, reading about dinosaurs to his 6-year-old daughter, was not a criminal, not a threat, and definitely not someone who should be approached with suspicion. He was the Honorable Magistrate Judge Thomas Reynolds, and the officer's body camera would capture every second of an incident that would become one of the most expensive and embarrassing racial profiling cases in the city's history. Thomas Reynolds had woken up that morning excited about his favorite Saturday ritual, taking his daughter Zoe to the library for story time and then letting her choose new books for the week. It was something he did almost every weekend when he wasn't in court, a tradition he had started when Zoe was only 3 years old. Thomas had worked as a magistrate judge for 8 years, presiding over preliminary hearings, issuing warrants, and making critical decisions in criminal and civil cases. He was respected by lawyers on both sides, known for his even temperament and deep knowledge of the law. But that Saturday afternoon, sitting in the children's section of the public library with his daughter on his lap, none of that would matter to the officer who was about to make the worst assumption of his career. Officer Brandon Cole had been called to the library on a vague report of someone acting suspiciously near the children's section. The call had come from a library patron who apparently found it concerning to see a black man sitting alone reading to a child, despite the fact that dozens of parents did exactly the same thing at the library every day without raising alarms. Cole had 4 years in the department and a clean disciplinary record, at least on paper. But what official records didn't show were multiple informal citizen complaints that had been filed away without proper investigation, all following the same pattern of Cole making assumptions based on race rather than actual behavior. When Cole entered the children's section of the library, he immediately focused on Thomas and Zoe. There were at least a dozen other parents with children in the same area, some white, some Asian, all doing exactly what Thomas was doing. Reading, exploring books, spending quality time with their kids. But Cole walked directly to Thomas with the body language of someone investigating criminal activity. He didn't approach casually or friendly, didn't make eye contact with Zoe or acknowledge he was clearly interrupting a moment between father and daughter. He simply began asking questions that assumed Thomas had no right to be there. Thomas noticed the officer approaching and immediately felt that familiar tension many black men know when law enforcement appears for no apparent reason. He was in a public space, doing a completely legal and normal activity, with his own daughter literally sitting on his lap, and yet he was about to be treated as suspicious. Zoe, who was only 6 years old, noticed the change in her father's body language and the presence of the uniformed officer, her eyes widening with that mix of curiosity and nervousness children feel when something in the adult world seems wrong. Cole activated his body camera as he approached, standard protocol for any public contact. This decision, made for accountability and protection reasons, would end up becoming the most damaging evidence against him in the city. The camera began recording an incident that would be dissected by lawyers, media, and the public, an incident that would prove beyond any reasonable doubt that racial profiling was alive and well, and that it could happen to anyone anywhere, even to a magistrate judge reading children's books with his daughter in a public library on a Saturday afternoon. Cole stopped directly in front of Thomas and Zoe, his presence blocking the light from the fluorescent fixtures above. He immediately began with questions any parent would recognize as accusatory rather than concerned. He asked Thomas what his relationship was with the child, as if a black man reading to a girl automatically needed to justify his presence. Thomas, keeping his voice calm and level, responded that Zoe was his daughter and they were making their weekly library visit. He pointed to the stack of children's books beside them, to the library card in Zoe's jacket pocket, trying to demonstrate through obvious visual evidence that this was a normal and routine activity for them. But Cole wasn't satisfied with that explanation. He pressed further, asking if Thomas had any identification proving he was Zoe's father. The question was asked loud enough that other nearby parents began looking, their conversations diminishing as they noticed what was happening. Thomas felt Zoe stiffen on his lap, her small hand gripping the dinosaur book tighter. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but could sense her father was being treated differently, that something was wrong with the way the officer was talking to them. Thomas placed a protective hand on Zoe's shoulder and asked Cole directly why he was being questioned. What was the probable cause for this investigative stop? Cole responded that he had received a report of suspicious activity, but when Thomas asked specifically what behavior had been suspicious, Cole became vague and defensive. He said he had the right to check any situation that seemed out of the ordinary, a statement that revealed much about what Cole considered out of the ordinary in a public library. Thomas noticed other parents, all white or Asian, sitting with their children in exactly the same way he was, and none of them were being questioned. The only difference was the color of his skin. A white woman a few meters away was reading to two children who clearly had different ages and ethnicities from her, possibly a babysitter or relative. But Cole hadn't approached her with questions about her relationship to the children. A librarian named Sandra Martinez, who had worked at the library for 15 years, noticed the confrontation and approached. Sandra knew Thomas and Zoe well. They were regular visitors, and she often helped Zoe find new books about animals, her current obsession. Sandra intervened politely, telling Cole that Thomas was a regular patron, that she knew him personally, and that he came to the library with his daughter almost every Saturday. She offered to check library records to show their borrowing history. Anything to resolve what she could see was clearly a misunderstanding based on incorrect assumptions. But Cole dismissed Sandra's assurances, saying he was conducting an official investigation and needed to verify Thomas's identity for himself. Thomas made a decision at that moment. He had every right to refuse to provide identification when he wasn't committing any crime, when he was simply sitting in a public space with his daughter. But he was also a father, and Zoe was becoming increasingly distressed, her eyes beginning to fill with tears as she sensed her father was in some kind of trouble she didn't understand. Thomas didn't want this to become a traumatic incident in his daughter's memory, didn't want her to grow up afraid of police or thinking her father had done something wrong. So he decided to end this in the quickest and least dramatic way possible, even if it meant yielding to a violation of his constitutional rights. Thomas took out his wallet and removed his driver's license, handing it to Cole. But along with the license, he also removed his official judicial identification card, the one he used to access restricted areas in the courthouse, which clearly identified him as Magistrate Judge Thomas Reynolds. He handed both to Cole without saying anything, letting the officer make the discovery himself. The body camera captured the exact moment Cole looked at both cards, his face changing from confident and authoritative to confused, then to concerned, and finally to something that looked very much like panic. He was holding the identification of a magistrate judge, someone who worked in the same criminal justice system he did, someone who understood the law probably better than anyone Cole had ever stopped, and someone who now had video evidence of being racially profiled in a public space while caring for his own daughter. Cole stood holding the two identification cards for a moment that seemed to last an eternity, captured in high definition by the camera on his chest. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again as if he were trying to find words that simply didn't exist to fix what he had just done. He looked back and forth between the cards and Thomas's face, processing the reality that he had just racially profiled a magistrate judge who had probably presided over dozens of cases involving his police department. Thomas remained sitting calmly, Zoe still on his lap, waiting to see how Cole would choose to handle his massive mistake. The library around them had become strangely quiet, other patrons now openly watching the situation unfold. Cole tried to shift his tone immediately, his voice becoming higher and more polite in a way that sounded completely false, given how he had been speaking just moments before. He began apologizing, saying he was just following procedure, that he didn't know who Thomas was, as if Thomas's profession was the problem instead of Cole's actions being fundamentally wrong, regardless of who was being targeted. He returned the identification cards with hands, the body camera captured trembling slightly. his attempt to appear professional and composed crumbling under the weight of realizing what he had done. Thomas took his cards back without saying anything, his expression remaining neutral, but his eyes communicating volumes about how unacceptable this entire situation was. Sandra Martinez wasn't letting this pass. She asked Cole to explain exactly what kind of suspicious activity had been reported, demanding specifics she knew he couldn't provide. Cole tried to say someone had called concerned about a child, but Sandra cut him off, pointing out there were literally a dozen adults with children in that section at that exact moment, and asking why Thomas had been the only one approached. Her voice was growing louder now, her indignation spilling over after years of seeing black patrons treated differently in her library. She said she had known Thomas for years, that he was a respected community member, a judge for God's sake, and that this was exactly the kind of racial profiling the library had trained staff to recognize and oppose. Other patrons began intervening too. An Asian woman who had been reading to her own children nearby approached and said she had seen the entire interaction from the beginning, that Thomas had done absolutely nothing suspicious or inappropriate, that he was clearly being targeted because of his race. An older man, white, with gray hair and glasses, walked over and identified himself as a criminal defense attorney who frequently appeared in Thomas's court. He told Cole directly that he had just committed a massive Fourth Amendment rights violation, that the entire interaction had been conducted without probable cause or reasonable suspicion, and that Thomas would have solid legal grounds for a SATI lawsuit for racial profiling and harassment. The body camera captured all of this, each witness offering condemnation of Cole's actions, building a case that would make it impossible for the department or city to claim later this had been a reasonable misunderstanding. Cole tried to back out of the situation, telling Thomas he was free to go, as if Thomas had ever not been free to go given he wasn't committing any crime. But Thomas wasn't ready to let this end so easily. He gently placed Zoe on the ground and told her to go choose one more book with librarian Sandra, removing his daughter from what was about to become a very adult conversation about accountability and consequences. Once Zoe was out of earshot, Thomas stood up and confronted Cole with the calm composure of someone who had spent years presiding over difficult cases and handling tense situations. He asked Cole directly if he routinely stopped white fathers at the library and demanded they prove their relationship to their children if he questioned white men in public spaces without any evidence of crime. Cole stumbled over his response, saying he treated everyone equally, that this had nothing to do with race. But Thomas interrupted him, pointing out that the body camera had captured everything, including the fact that there were multiple other parents in the same area doing exactly the same activity, and Cole had walked directly to the only black father. Thomas then formally identified himself as Magistrate Judge Reynolds, stating his title and position not as a threat, but as a statement of fact Cole needed to understand. He told Cole he would likely see Thomas again in professional contexts, that his police department appeared regularly in Thomas's court for warrants and preliminary hearings, and that Thomas would have to decide if this incident reflected the kind of judgment and professionalism he wanted to see from officers presenting cases in his court. The body camera captured the realization slowly sinking into Cole's face that he hadn't just made a legal and ethical mistake, he had potentially damaged the working relationship between his department and a key judicial officer whose decisions impacted police work daily. Cole left the library 20 minutes later, his body camera still recording as he walked back to his patrol car with hunched shoulders and the expression of someone who knew his career had just taken a catastrophic turn. He had tried to apologize 3 more times before leaving, each attempt sounding more desperate than the last, but Thomas had simply said that apologies at that point were inadequate and that the incident would be reported through appropriate channels. The body camera captured Cole making the long walk through the library corridors, passing patrons who watched him with expressions ranging from disapproval to absolute disbelief. He had entered the library confident in his authority and was leaving with the realization he had committed one of the most expensive and publicly embarrassing mistakes any officer could make. Thomas wasted no time documenting everything. Still at the library, he used his phone to write detailed notes of every aspect of the interaction, while the details were still fresh in his memory. He noted the exact time, the specific words Cole had used, the presence of other parents who weren't questioned, the statements from Sandra Martinez and other witnesses, and most critically, the fact that Cole had activated his body camera from the beginning. Thomas knew that recording would be crucial evidence, and he wanted to ensure it was properly preserved through official requests before anyone at the police department could consider making it disappear. He also took photos of the children's section, showing the layout and the other parents present, creating his own visual record to complement the official video. Sandra Martinez provided a written statement that same afternoon, detailing everything she had witnessed and emphasizing that Thomas and Zoe were regular and familiar patrons who had never caused any problem or concern. She included information about their library borrowing records going back years, proving the established pattern of normal father-daughter visits. The Asian woman who had intervened, a nurse named Lisa Chen, also provided her contact information and offered to testify about what she had observed. The defense attorney, Robert Martinez, who knew Thomas professionally, sent a formal email that evening offering to serve as a witness and noting he was prepared to testify about the clear lack of probable cause or reasonable suspicion for the initial stop. Thomas was building a case that would be impossible for the department to refute or minimize. Monday morning, Thomas contacted a civil rights attorney specializing in racial profiling cases and police misconduct. The attorney, a woman named Patricia Johnson, who had won multiple high-profile cases against police departments, listened to Thomas's account and immediately recognized this was an exceptionally strong case. The combination of Thomas's position as a magistrate judge, the presence of his young daughter, the completely innocent setting of a public library, the multiple independent witnesses, and most importantly, the complete body camera recording from the officer himself created a situation where denial or rationalization would be impossible. Patricia agreed to take the case and immediately sent evidence preservation letters to the police department, the city, and the library, demanding that all body camera footage, dispatch records, and any other related material be preserved. The body camera footage was officially requested through public records request within 48 hours. The police department, already aware this was a potentially explosive incident given who was involved, placed Cole on administrative leave immediately while they conducted a preliminary review. When supervisors watched the recording, the reaction was one of shock and barely contained anger. The video showed everything in clear and unequivocal detail. Cole approaching Thomas for no apparent reason, asking accusatory questions while completely ignoring other parents doing exactly the same activity, persisting even after a library employee confirmed Thomas's identity. And then the humiliating revelation when he realized that he had racially profiled a magistrate judge. There was no way to spin this as a reasonable misunderstanding or standard procedure gone wrong. This was racial profiling captured in high definition. Police Chief Raymond Torres made the unusual decision to contact Thomas personally before the incident became public. Torres had worked with Thomas professionally for years, respected him as a judge, and understood the magnitude of what had happened. He met with Thomas privately, without lawyers present initially, and offered a sincere apology on behalf of the department. Torres admitted Cole had acted inappropriately, that the incident represented exactly the type of racial profiling the department claimed to be working to eliminate, and that there would be consequences. But he also implored Thomas to consider how this would be handled, noting that a public lawsuit would cost the city millions and damage the relationship between the department and the court. Thomas listened respectfully, but made clear that while he appreciated Torres's personal apology, this wasn't something that could be resolved with private conversation and promises to do better. Zoe had cried that night, asking her father why the policeman had been so mean to him, asking if her father had done something wrong. That trauma to his daughter, that humiliation in a public space, demanded more than apologies. It demanded real accountability, systemic change, and yes, compensation that reflected the seriousness of the rights violation. The internal investigation began immediately. But unlike many police misconduct cases that dragged on for months while departments tried to protect their own, this case moved forward with unusual speed. The reason was simple. The victim was a magistrate judge who understood the system inside and out. The video evidence was irrefutable, and the department knew that trying to cover up or minimize this would only make the eventual lawsuit more expensive and destructive. Investigators interviewed Cole, Sandra Martinez, Lisa Chen, Robert Martinez, and a dozen other library patrons who had witnessed parts of the interaction. Each interview added more weight to the case against Cole, confirming that Thomas had done absolutely nothing to justify the initial stop, that other white and Asian parents were doing identical activities without being questioned, and that the only logical explanation for Cole singling out Thomas was racial profiling based on the color of his skin. Investigators also dug deeper into Cole's history and found a troubling pattern the department had failed to address adequately. There were 6 informal complaints over his 4 years in the department, all involving allegations that Cole had stopped or questioned black citizens without apparent cause. These complaints had never been formalized or properly investigated because the victims hadn't followed through with formal documentation, often out of fear of retaliation or simply exhaustion from having to repeatedly prove they had the right to exist in public spaces. One complaint involved Cole stopping a young black man who was waiting outside a coffee shop for his friend, demanding to see identification and questioning what he was doing there. Another involved Cole following a black couple for several blocks in his patrol car before finally stopping them for an alleged equipment violation that subsequent inspection proved didn't exist. The pattern was clear and damning, and the department had negligently allowed it to continue without intervention. The body camera video leaked to media within a week, despite the department's efforts to keep it confidential during the investigation. Someone inside the department, probably an officer tired of seeing misconduct protected, sent the complete footage to local news stations and social media platforms. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. People watched in horror and anger as Cole approached Thomas and Zoe without reason, interrogated a father who was simply reading to his daughter, ignored a library employee's intervention, and then reacted with visible panic when he realized he had racially profiled a judge. The video was shared millions of times in the first 72 hours, with hashtags like Justice for Judge Reynolds and library profiling trending nationally. News commentators discussed the case extensively, noting that if a respected magistrate judge could be treated this way in a public space with his young daughter, what hope did the average black citizen have when confronted with biased officers? The pressure on the department and city intensified exponentially when national civil rights organizations began weighing in. The NAACP issued a statement condemning the incident and demanding not just Cole's firing, but comprehensive systemic reforms in how the department trained officers and handled racial profiling complaints. The ACLU announced it was monitoring the case closely and considering intervening as amicus curiae if it went to trial. A group of 127 judges from across the state, including several state Supreme Court justices, signed an open letter expressing solidarity with Thomas and noting the incident highlighted broader problems of how law enforcement officers sometimes treated black legal professionals and citizens with disrespect they would never direct at their white counterparts. The letter was published in major newspapers and amplified the story further, transforming it from a local incident into a national symbol of persistent racial profiling. The police union initially tried to defend Cole, issuing a generic statement about officers doing difficult work and deserving due process. But when the video became public and the backlash went viral, even the union backed away from their support. The union president gave a disastrous interview where he tried to suggest perhaps Cole had just made an honest error in judgment, but the interviewer pressed him on the pattern of previous complaints and the obvious fact that other parents weren't questioned. The interview became another viral video, with the union president appearing increasingly defensive and disconnected from the reality millions of people had just witnessed in the body camera footage. The backlash against the union was so severe they eventually issued a second statement. Acknowledging Cole's actions appeared problematic and that they wouldn't stand in the way of appropriate disciplinary process, a rare concession that signaled how indefensible the case was, even for professional defenders of officers. The final investigation report was completed in 6 weeks, record speed for an internal police investigation. The findings were unequivocal and devastating for Cole and embarrassing for the department. Investigators determined Cole had violated multiple departmental policies, including procedures for investigative contacts, respectful treatment of citizens, and fundamental constitutional duties related to the Fourth Amendment. The report specifically found that Cole had no reasonable suspicion or articulable probable cause to stop Thomas, that his actions demonstrated clear racial bias given other parents weren't questioned, and that his behavior created significant harm both to the victim and to the department's relationship with the community. The report also severely criticized the department's previous failures to adequately address Cole's pattern of problematic behavior, noting that the 6 previous informal complaints should have triggered intervention and retraining long before the incident with Thomas occurred. The final recommendation was immediate termination, permanent revocation of police certification, and referral of the case to the district attorney for possible criminal prosecution for civil rights deprivation. Cole was officially fired 8 weeks after the library incident. His 4-year career ended by a pattern of racism that finally encountered the wrong victim in the wrong circumstances, with evidence that made denial impossible. The civil lawsuit filed by Thomas Reynolds against the city, the police department, and Brandon Cole personally was filed in federal court 3 months after the library incident. Patricia Johnson, his attorney, built a case that was virtually bulletproof, grounded in the body camera footage that showed every second of the rights violation, reinforced by statements from multiple independent witnesses, and strengthened by the documented pattern of previous complaints the department had negligently ignored. The lawsuit alleged Fourth Amendment violations, racial profiling under state and federal civil rights laws, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and most critically, municipal liability for failure to properly train and supervise officers despite knowledge of problematic patterns. The amount sought was substantial, not just to compensate Thomas for the harm and humiliation, but to send a clear message that racial profiling would carry severe financial consequences that would make cities think twice about allowing such behavior to continue unchecked. The city initially tried to defend the case, their lawyers filing motions to dismiss various claims and arguing Cole had acted within his discretion as a law enforcement officer. But these defenses crumbled quickly under the weight of evidence. The body camera recording made it impossible to argue Cole had reasonable suspicion. The multiple witnesses made it impossible to argue this had been an isolated misunderstanding, and the pattern of previous complaints made it impossible for the city to argue they had no knowledge of problems with Cole. During the discovery phase, Patricia's lawyers obtained access to the department's training records and found that implicit bias and racial profiling training was superficial at best. Consisting of a 2-hour online module, officers completed once every 2 years without any follow-up or assessment. They also discovered the department had no early warning system to identify officers with complaint patterns, meaning the 6 informal complaints against Cole had simply disappeared into files without ever triggering any kind of review or intervention. The depositions were devastating for the city's defense. Cole was deposed for 6 hours, and his inability to articulate any legitimate reason for having stopped Thomas became painfully obvious. When asked directly why he hadn't questioned other parents at the library that day, Cole stumbled and stammered, eventually admitting Thomas had stood out to him, an admission Patricia immediately pursued by asking specifically what about Thomas sitting quietly reading to his daughter had stood out. Cole couldn't provide an answer that didn't essentially admit Thomas's race had been the determining factor. Department supervisors were equally ineffective under questioning, forced to admit they had knowledge of previous complaints against Cole, but hadn't taken any meaningful action, that their racial profiling training was inadequate, and that they had no systems in place to identify and correct officers with problematic patterns before those patterns escalated to serious incidents. The city made its first settlement offer 6 months after the lawsuit was filed, an amount Patricia immediately rejected as insultingly low given the clarity of evidence and seriousness of violations. The city came back with a second offer, then a third, each increasing but still not fully acknowledging the magnitude of what had happened. Patricia made clear Thomas wasn't interested in a quick settlement that let the city avoid public accountability. He wanted not just financial compensation, reflecting the seriousness of the rights violation, but also a consent decree requiring specific and measurable reforms in how the department trained officers, investigated complaints, and monitored officers with problematic patterns. Negotiations dragged on for months, with Patricia using the threat of a public trial where the body camera video would be played for a jury as leverage to extract increasingly larger concessions from the city. The final settlement was announced 15 months after the library incident, and its terms sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country. The city agreed to pay $500,000 to Thomas Reynolds, one of the largest racial profiling settlements in the state's history. But the money was only part of it. The settlement also required the city to implement a comprehensive police reform program developed by outside experts, including mandatory quarterly training on implicit bias and racial profiling, with assessments officers needed to pass to remain active. Creation of a computerized early warning system that would automatically track complaints and identify officers with problematic patterns, revised policies on investigative stops requiring officers to articulate specific reasonable suspicion before initiating contact, and independent outside oversight of the complaint investigation process for 5 years. The settlement also required the department to publish annual data on police stops disaggregated by race, allowing researchers and advocates to identify whether racial disparities existed in law enforcement practices. Thomas used a portion of his settlement to establish a foundation focused on educating citizens, particularly black citizens, about their constitutional rights during police encounters. The Zoe Reynolds Foundation, named after his daughter, provided free resources, community workshops, and even legal assistance for people who experienced racial profiling but didn't have means to pursue justice on their own. Thomas gave extensive interviews about the incident, speaking candidly and emotionally about how it felt to be treated like a criminal in front of his daughter, about Zoe's tears that night asking if her father had done something wrong, about the humiliation of having to prove he had the right to exist in a public space. He used his platform as a judge and now as an advocate to argue racial profiling wasn't just an issue of individual rights being violated, but a systemic problem that eroded trust between communities and law enforcement, making police work harder and putting everyone in danger. The body camera video became one of the most widely used police training recordings in American history, shown in police academies across all 50 states. Instructors used it as a perfect example of how not to conduct an investigative stop, pausing at key moments to analyze Cole's failures in judgment, the lack of articulable reasonable suspicion, the failure to recognize his own bias in selecting Thomas while ignoring other parents, the unnecessary escalation when confronted with information contradicting his assumptions, and the final panic when he realized he had racially profiled someone with the power to hold him accountable. The video was also used in law school classes teaching about Fourth Amendment rights, in corporate diversity trainings discussing implicit bias, and in public library training sessions on how to recognize and respond to racial profiling of patrons. Brandon Cole became a case study, his face and name forever associated with the consequences of letting prejudice guide professional actions. Cole disappeared from public life after his firing, his attempts to find work in law enforcement or private security repeatedly frustrated by the viral video any search of his name would immediately reveal. There were reports he moved to another state and changed careers entirely, working in an unrelated field where his past was less likely to follow him. The library where it all happened installed a small plaque in the children's section, not mentioning the incident specifically, but dedicating the space to principles of equal dignity, respectful treatment, and barrier-free access to information for all community members regardless of race. Sandra Martinez, the librarian who had intervened, was honored by the State Library Association for her courage in confronting Cole, and she became a sought-after speaker on the role of public institutions in standing against racism. Zoe Reynolds, now years older, still went to the library with her father almost every Saturday, but the dynamic had changed in ways Thomas found both heartening and sad. She had developed a keen awareness of fairness and equity, often pointing out when she noticed people being treated differently based on how they looked. Thomas was proud of her awareness, but also regretted she had to learn about racism so young that her innocence had been punctured by that afternoon at the library when she was only 6 years old. He often thought about how many other black children went through similar moments, watching their parents be treated with suspicion and disrespect, internalizing messages about their own worth and safety in the world. It motivated him to continue his advocacy work even when it was emotionally exhausting to revisit the incident repeatedly in interviews and speeches. The lasting legacy of the case extended far beyond one financial settlement or departmental policy reforms. It became a cultural reference point, mentioned whenever conversations about racial profiling arose, cited in legal briefs and judicial decisions, referenced by politicians debating law enforcement reforms. The fact the victim was a respected magistrate judge rather than an unknown young black man forced even skeptical observers to acknowledge racial profiling wasn't about individual behavior, but about how society viewed and treated black people regardless of their accomplishments or character. It couldn't be dismissed as a young man wearing wrong clothes in the wrong place, not when it was a judge in professional attire, reading to his daughter at a library on a Saturday afternoon. The sheer absurdity and injustice of it captured in high-definition video made denial impossible and forced uncomfortable but necessary conversations about bias, privilege, and justice. Thomas remained on the bench as a magistrate judge, continued serving with distinction, but he was changed by the experience in ways that shaped his approach to work. When officers appeared in his court presenting cases, he found himself assessing them more critically, questioning their probable cause more rigorously, paying closer attention to patterns in who they arrested and how they described suspects. He didn't become anti-police. He still believed effective and equitable law enforcement was essential for communities to function, but he also could no longer automatically give officers the benefit of the doubt he might have given before experiencing firsthand how some officers operated based on assumption rather than evidence, prejudice rather than procedure. The incident had given him perspective that made him a better judge, albeit at the cost of personal humiliation and trauma to his daughter. The body camera recording remained online, viewable by anyone who wanted to see what racial profiling looked like when captured without filters or interpretations. It served as proof that technology meant to protect officers from false accusations also held them accountable when they crossed lines, that body cameras were tools for transparency that worked both ways. For Thomas, the existence of that video transformed what could have been merely his word against an officer's word into irrefutable evidence justice had been violated. For the city, it cost $500,000 and forced reforms that would make law enforcement more expensive and more complicated for years to come. For Cole, it cost everything. And for millions of people who watched the video, it offered a clear glimpse of a reality many had denied existed, proof racial profiling was alive and prevalent, and that it could happen to anyone anywhere, even a judge reading children's books with his daughter. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, the library incident became more than just a story about one officer making a mistake. It became a symbol of accountability winning, evidence mattering, and one person refusing to accept injustice even when it would have been easier to simply walk away and try to forget.